Okay, so you know that feeling when you're really curious about something?
Yeah.
Something important, like a big important idea?
Right.
But then you realize it's going to involve reading a ton of like really dense academic writing.
Wow.
Not really how I want to spend my free time.
Right.
So that's kind of why we do this show.
Yeah.
And today we're looking at Voltaire's Candide.
Okay.
This is your shortcut to understanding a really important 18th century critique
Okay.
of a major way of seeing the world.
Yeah.
And you don't have to become a philosophy expert to get it.
That's right. We're going to dive into Candide,
Okay.
which is a novella by Voltaire.
Right.
A really influential French philosopher.
Yeah.
And it was published way back in 1759.
Wow.
And it's worth noting that he wrote this in French.
Okay.
But we're going to be talking about it
Right.
in translation as you'd encounter it.
Yeah, for this deep dive,
Yeah.
we've got some sharp analysis to help us out here,
Yeah.
including a lecture that unpacks Candide for us, gives us the context around the 18th century,
Yeah.
and the core of Voltaire's arguments.
Exactly. So our mission today
Yes.
is to really unpack the central arguments of Candide.
Okay.
Specifically how this relatively short work
Right.
could be such a strong challenge
Yeah.
to the optimistic worldview that was so prevalent in the 18th century.
Okay, so let's set the stage a little bit here.
Yeah.
The 18th century, more than just powdered wigs and fancy parties, right?
It was.
Seems like there was a real shift going on in the way people thought.
Absolutely. The 18th century was a period of really big change
Okay.
in terms of how people understood the world.
Okay.
There was a really strong emphasis on reason.
Okay.
A lot of excitement around scientific discoveries
Yeah.
and an expansion of knowledge through geographical exploration.
Maps and stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So people were starting to place
Yeah.
more emphasis on their own minds
Okay.
and what they could figure out
Yeah.
through reason and observation.
Instead of just taking things for granted.
Exactly. Rather than relying solely on tradition
Right.
or, just accepting things that had always been believed.
Yeah. Okay, so this idea of optimism was a really big deal back then.
It really was.
Like this feeling that things were on the up and up.
Yes, this dominant idea of optimism
Right.
had a few key elements.
Okay.
First, there was this real belief in the goodness of humanity.
Okay.
The idea that people were naturally good.
Yeah.
And that went along with a strong belief in God,
Okay.
a God who was benevolent and all-powerful.
Oh, right.
And crucially, this concept of progress,
Okay.
the idea that society was moving forward in a linear fashion.
In a straight line.
Exactly. Always getting better,
Okay.
with no chance of regressing.
So like no turning back the clock.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So for many, the outlook was bright
Right.
and progress was seen as inevitable.
Yeah. But we know reality has a way of complicating things.
It certainly does.
Right.
The 18th century, despite these optimistic ideals,
Okay.
also presented stark contradictions. Think about natural disasters.
Okay.
The Lisbon earthquake is a really good example.
Yeah.
Then you have civil wars,
Right.
widespread disease,
Of course.
the everyday experience of pain,
Right.
and of course the existence of evil.
Hard to reconcile those things with a perfect world.
It is, and that's exactly what philosophers
Okay.
began to grapple with.
Okay.
How to reconcile these terrible events
Right.
with this idea of a benevolent God
Yeah.
in charge of a perfect world.
Yeah, it makes you think.
It does. And so they started to use reason
Okay.
to scrutinize these long-held beliefs
Okay.
and question these traditional ways of thinking.
In light of what they were seeing.
Precisely. And that brings us to Voltaire,
Okay.
a philosopher who was not buying into
Yeah.
this rosy picture of the world.
He wasn't convinced.
Not at all.
Okay.
Voltaire was a very strong critic of the optimistic worldview.
Okay.
And when he looked at all this suffering,
Oh,
the
yeah.
pain, the disease, the wars,
Right.
the natural disasters,
Yeah.
he just couldn't reconcile that with a truly optimistic world.
It seemed like a stretch.
It did.
Okay, so Voltaire being Voltaire, he didn't just read a boring paper about it.
He did not.
He found a more interesting way to make his point.
He chose to write a story.
Okay.
He wrote Candide as a direct challenge
Okay.
to the philosophy of optimism.
Interesting. So he chose fiction.
He did.
Interesting.
And specifically, he wrote a novella.
Okay, so a novella.
Yeah?
Longer than a short story, but shorter than a novel?
Exactly.
Right.
It's kind of a sweet spot.
Right.
Gives him space to develop the characters and plot.
Yeah.
But it's still a pretty quick read.
Yeah.
And we mentioned we're looking at it
Oh, right.
in translation.
Okay.
But the core ideas come through really well.
That makes sense. So who are the main characters in Candide?
Right at the center, we have Candide himself,
Okay.
the hero of the story.
The guy we follow along with.
Exactly. He's portrayed as a young,
Okay.
somewhat naive, and very inexperienced guy.
Yeah.
His worldview is shaped largely by his tutor.
His teacher.
Yes, a man named Pangloss.
Pangloss. That name's kind of funny.
It is, isn't it?
A little on the nose.
It does seem that way.
Okay.
And then there's Cunegande,
Okay.
Candide's love interest.
I got it.
The story starts in Westphalia,
Where's that?
a region in Germany.
Okay.
Candide's living on this baron's estate,
Okay.
and he's expelled.
Kicked out.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he learns that Cunegande has been kidnapped
I know.
during a war.
So he sets off to find her.
He does.
It's a classic quest.
It is, but it becomes much more than a simple rescue mission,
Okay. I can see that coming.
right? His physical journey through all these different countries
Yeah.
becomes a real philosophical journey.
Okay.
Every new place, every new person challenges his optimistic worldview.
Right. That he learned from Pangloss.
Exactly. And the Lisbon earthquake is a huge turning point.
Okay. Tell me about that.
This devastating earthquake,
Okay.
followed by fires and a tsunami,
Oh, wow.
caused an insane amount of death and destruction.
Oh, man.
This event really forces Candide
Yeah.
and the reader to question
Okay.
this whole idea of a benevolent God
Yeah.
and a perfect world.
Yeah, because how could a loving God allow something like that?
Exactly. And what's Pangloss's explanation?
Yeah.
Yeah.
What does he say about this?
Well, predictably, Pangloss tries to rationalize the suffering.
Of course he does.
He argues that humans have limited knowledge.
Okay.
We can't understand God's plan.
Okay.
We see these horrible events,
Right.
but they're just a small part of a larger,
Okay.
ultimately good plan.
So it's all part of a bigger picture
Right.
that we just can't see.
Exactly. But as Candide experiences more of the world's horrors,
Right.
these explanations start to ring hollow.
Yeah, I bet.
They don't really make sense anymore.
Right.
And then there's this incident with the drowning Anabaptist.
Oh, yeah. What was that about?
So they encounter this guy
Okay.
struggling in the water.
Okay.
Candide wants to help.
Yeah, naturally.
But Pangloss stops him.
What?
He says that the man was meant to die there.
That's messed up.
It is a really chilling justification.
Right.
It shows the dark side of this optimistic philosophy.
Like taken to an extreme.
Exactly where logic and reason are used to justify inaction.
Even in the face of someone suffering.
Right. And then we're introduced to the old woman.
Okay.
She has a really powerful story to tell.
What's her story about?
It's a personal account of suffering.
Okay.
Her life has been filled with misery.
Like what kind of misery?
She talks about poverty,
Okay.
humiliation, even forced prostitution.
That's awful.
It is, and it's a direct challenge to the optimistic worldview.
Because it shows the reality of things.
Exactly, the reality of suffering that many people face.
Right. And this isn't just an abstract idea.
It's not. It's a lived experience.
And what about Cunegonde?
When Candide finally finds her,
Yeah.
she recounts her own suffering.
So she hasn't been having a good time either.
Not at all. She's experienced abuse and hardship.
So much for the best of all possible worlds.
Right. Her experiences further chip away
Yeah.
at Pangloss's optimistic claims.
And it seems like the bad luck just keeps coming.
It does. And then we have the encounter with the enslaved man.
Okay.
This is a really powerful moment.
What happened?
Candide sees the cruelty of slavery firsthand.
Oh, wow.
This man has had his limbs cut off
Oh, my God.
for profit.
That's horrific.
It is. And the enslaved man says
Yeah.
that he's more miserable than any animal.
That's a powerful statement.
It is. And it has a profound effect on Candide.
Yeah, I bet.
He's starting to really question Pangloss's optimism.
But then they find El Dorado.
Right.
This seems like a perfect place.
It does. It's a land of immense wealth,
Okay.
where gold is treated as commonplace.
But it's nothing special.
Exactly. The people are healthy, honest, and they live long lives.
Wow, it's like a utopia.
It is, and it stands in stark contrast
Yeah.
to the suffering they've witnessed.
So what's the point of El Dorado?
Well, it's a critique of European values. It's like materialism and greed.
Okay.
They meet a 172-year-old man
Wow.
who says their longevity is due to their simple life.
So it's a commentary on the way people live.
Exactly. It
Yeah.
makes you think about what's truly important.
But of course they don't stay in El Dorado.
They don't.
Why not?
Despite its perfection,
Yeah.
Candide and Cacambo choose to leave.
Taking a ton of gold with them.
They do. They're drawn back to their old desires.
Like wanting more.
Exactly. And Candide still wants to rescue Cunegonde.
Right.
It shows how strong those old ways of thinking are.
Even when you've seen a better way.
Right.
So they end up in the Ottoman Empire.
They do. They arrive in Constantinople.
Okay.
Still searching for that best of all possible worlds.
They just can't let it go.
It seems not. But at this point,
Yeah.
Candide's quest has changed.
In what way?
It's not just about finding Cunegande.
Okay.
It's about finding meaning in a chaotic world.
A world full of suffering.
Exactly.
And they meet some interesting people there.
They do. They meet a dervish who talks about the futility of human desires.
Like wanting things you don't need.
Right. And then there's the old farmer.
Okay, what's his deal?
He rejects Pangloss's abstract philosophies.
Okay.
He advocates for practical work.
Like hands-on stuff.
Exactly. He famously tells them to tend their garden.
I've heard that one before.
It's a really important message.
What does it mean?
It means focus on what you can control.
Okay.
Focus on your own life and your work.
Instead of worrying about the big picture.
Right. Find meaning in the everyday.
That makes sense. So what are the main takeaways from Candide?
Well, the novella really explores this tension
Okay.
between optimism and the reality of suffering.
Right.
The conclusion emphasizes practical action.
Tending your garden.
Exactly. Voltaire is saying
Yeah.
that we can't just theorize about a perfect world.
Right.
We have to engage with the world as it is.
Deal with the problems.
Exactly. And he rejects the idea
Okay.
that everything is for the best.
He's not buying it.
Nope.
So Voltaire, the philosopher, what kind of thinker was he?
He was an empirical philosopher.
What does that mean?
He valued knowledge from experience.
Stuff you can see and hear.
Exactly. He was skeptical of purely intellectual arguments
Okay.
or arguments based on faith.
Unless they could be tested.
Right. He wanted evidence.
He was also against organized religion.
He was particularly Christianity and Judaism.
Because of the supernatural stuff?
Exactly. He found those elements problematic.
So Candide was probably pretty controversial.
It was.
Back in the day.
Yeah, it challenged a lot of accepted ideas.
And the authorities weren't too happy.
Not really. Voltaire knew it would be controversial.
How do we know that?
He published it simultaneously in 3 different countries.
Wow.
Paris, Geneva, and Amsterdam.
To get ahead of the censors.
Maybe.
And he used a pseudonym
He did. He said it was from the German of Dr. Ralph.
to protect himself.
Most likely.
Smart move.
Yeah.
So where does Candide fit in with other literature?
It's definitely part of the travel literature tradition.
Because of all the travel.
Exactly. The characters move from place to place.
Right.
Experiencing different cultures.
It's like a road trip.
In a way, and this genre has a long history.
Okay.
From religious quests to explorers' accounts.
Okay, so how does Candide use those travel elements?
Well, it's more specifically an anti-utopian work.
Meaning?
It shows the misery and corruption of the real world.
Okay.
It's not a utopia, it's a dystopia.
A world gone wrong.
Exactly.
Were there any specific influences on Voltaire?
There probably were.
Like what?
Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels is a possible influence.
Okay.
Another satire that critiques society.
Through imaginary voyages.
Right.
Okay.
And Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe,
Okay.
which also involves encounters with different societies.
Okay.
Even Samuel Johnson,
Okay.
who disagreed with Voltaire on many things,
Okay.
also explored themes of human misery
So they were all grappling with the problem of suffering.
in their own ways.
So is Candide just a travel story with a message?
It's more than that, but its genre is still debated.
What do people say it is?
Some say it's a philosophical tale.
Because it deals with big ideas.
Exactly. Others say it's a satire
Okay.
because it mocks society and its beliefs.
So it could be both.
It could.
And the narrator plays a role in the satire.
The implied narrator, Dr. Ralph,
Right.
often seems naive.
Like he's not getting it.
Exactly. And that creates irony.
Right.
The contrast between what's said
Yeah.
and what's really happening.
So like Candide's optimism versus the reality he faces.
Precisely. And that irony creates humor.
So it's funny and thought-provoking.
Exactly.
And Pangloss is like the poster child for optimism.
He's a caricature.
Right.
He embodies optimism taken to an absurd extreme.
And Voltaire's using him to make a point.
Exactly. He's
Yeah.
a target of the satire.
Okay, so why was optimism so popular back then?
Well, the 18th century saw real progress.
Okay.
A rising middle class, better living conditions.
People had reasons to be optimistic.
They did, and there were key philosophers.
Who promoted those ideas?
Exactly like Anthony Ashley Cooper.
Okay.
The Earl of Shaftesbury.
Right.
He wrote about the inherent goodness of humanity.
People are naturally good.
Right.
Okay.
And Alexander Pope,
The poet.
yes, he wrote Essay on Man,
Right.
which tried to explain God's plan.
Okay.
He said that what we see as evil is just partial evil.
part of a bigger good.
Exactly. And his famous line,
Go on.
whatever is right.
Wow, that's a bold statement.
It is.
Okay, who else?
Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz.
Okay.
He argued that God's perfection
Right.
means the world must be the best possible world.
So even the bad stuff is part of the plan.
According to Leibniz, yes.
So on one side, you have these optimistic arguments.
And on the other side, you have Voltaire.
The empiricist,
Exactly.
focusing on experience.
Voltaire couldn't ignore the suffering he saw.
Right.
He felt those abstract arguments were insufficient.
They didn't account for real-world pain.
Exactly. And then you have the Lisbon earthquake.
This was a major event.
It was a huge earthquake, followed by fires and a
A
tsunami.
triple whack,
And it happened on All Saints' Day.
a religious holiday.
It made people question God's goodness.
How could this happen?
Right. And the ongoing wars
Yeah.
further highlighted human cruelty.
So Voltaire uses Candide to challenge these optimistic ideas.
He uses irony and satire.
Okay, give me an example.
He critiques Pope's line,
Mm-hmm.
whatever is right,
Okay.
by suggesting that a God who doesn't intervene in evil
Yeah.
is complicit in that evil.
Interesting.
And he has Pangloss say these optimistic things
Yeah.
at the worst possible times.
Like what?
Like when he says the Lisbon harbor was built
Yeah.
for the Anabaptists to drown in.
That's dark.
It is, but it highlights the absurdity of the argument.
So it's funny, but in a disturbing way.
Exactly, and he mocks these seemingly logical arguments.
Like the volcano being in the right place.
Precisely, he points out that they don't explain why.
The ultimate cause of suffering.
Right, and he criticizes the reliance on religious dogma.
Like original sin.
Exactly, he finds that explanation unconvincing.
Yeah. And then you have the female narrators
Yes, they provide a really important perspective.
on the reality of suffering,
Exactly. They offer firsthand accounts of hardship.
which the optimistic philosophers often ignored.
They did.
Who are these key female voices?
We have Cunegonde,
Okay.
who talks about her own experiences of abuse,
Right.
and the old woman,
Okay.
who shares her life story of misery and hardship,
And Paquette.
who reveals her own tragic decline.
These women challenge the optimistic worldview.
Their stories expose the suffering.
That's often hidden.
Exactly. They show the reality of life for men and
Yeah.
women.
And El Dorado is interesting.
It is this seemingly perfect place.
Right. But they don't stay there.
They don't.
Why is that significant?
Well, it shows that even in a utopia,
Okay.
human flaws can prevent true happiness.
Like greed and wanting more.
Exactly. They can't escape their old ways of thinking.
Even in paradise.
Right.
And then the Ottoman Empire.
This introduces the idea of fatalism, the belief that everything is predetermined.
Okay.
It's a different way of looking at the world.
And Voltaire's exploring that too.
He's looking at different belief systems.
To see if any of them offer real answers.
Exactly. So to wrap up, what's the core message of Candide?
What's Voltaire trying to tell us?
I think he's challenging us
Okay.
to avoid simplistic optimism.
In the face of real-world suffering.
Right. He wants us to see the gap
Okay.
between idealistic theories and the reality of human experience.
And to focus on action.
Yes. Tending our own gardens.
Making a difference where we can...
Precisely.
So why should we care about these ideas today?
Well, these questions about optimism and suffering
Right.
are still relevant.
In what way?
We still face huge challenges.
Like what?
Natural disasters, pandemics, injustice.
Yeah.
Voltaire's critique reminds us
Okay.
to avoid naive optimism.
And to be realistic.
Exactly, and to focus on what we can actually do.
To make things better.
Right.
So if people want to learn more...
I highly recommend reading Candide.
The whole thing!
Yes, it's a short but powerful work.
And it's funny.
In a dark way.
So a final thought for our listeners.
Yes.
How do we balance hope with realism?
That's the question.
In a world full of suffering,
Right.
is tending our garden a form of resignation
Or a necessary first step.
towards a better world?
Something to think about.